to Rising. We've got another great show for you today to kick off your week. Full disclosure, we have actually pre-taped a few of these segments for our 4th of July break. We decided that the staff needed a break. We needed a break. So we're all very excited, however, about the show. We do, in fact, have new content for you, and we'll also be replaying some of our greatest hits for you to enjoy. Briahna, take us away.
I don't know what you're talking about, Robby. I just happen to have been wearing the same clothes since last Thursday. I came in, we're doing a split screen. I'm ready to go with some fresh new content. No, of course not. But there's still some really good stuff coming up. For example, a recent 2024 Democratic primary poll from Fox News shows Joe Biden with 64% support, but Robert Kennedy Jr. with 17% and Marianne Williamson with 10%. The candidates' respective support remains steady from previous polls from the past few months, indicating, I think, a level of strength here with these two insurgent candidates that many people didn't predict.
Well, meanwhile, analysts from 538 are pondering why RFK Jr. is polling at double digits. Let's hear some of that.
This polling example relates to the candidacy of Robert Francis Kennedy Jr. Last week, the New York Times published an article headlined, "Why Robert Kennedy Jr.'s 2024 bid is a headache for Biden." And the piece reads, quote, "Mr. Kennedy's support from Democrats, as high as 20% in some surveys, serves as a bracing reminder of left-leaning voters' healthy appetite for a Biden alternative, and as a glaring symbol of the president's weakness." They continue, "The place Mr. Kennedy might prove the biggest nuisance is New Hampshire, where the president has alienated core supporters by shuffling the Democratic presidential nominating calendar to put South Carolina's primary first, ahead of the Granite State. New Hampshire Democrats worry that Mr. Biden may skip their primary, which is likely to come before the slot allocated to the state by the Democratic National Committee. They also worry that if Mr. Biden does participate, enough independent voters angry with him for trying to elevate South Carolina may cast a protest vote for Mr. Kennedy to deal the president an early but cosmetic primary defeat." Okay, Kaylee, is this write-up based on, polls as we've seen ourselves that show Biden in the 60s with RFK Jr. in the 20s in terms of percentage support? Is it a good or bad use of polling?
I feel like this is a bad use of polling. We're giving way too much credit here. A headache for Biden? I don't know. I feel like this is more like a hangnail than a headache. It's like, would it be great to have zero challengers in the primary, and especially, someone with great name recognition not running? Sure, but this is not really a serious issue. I think there's certainly criticisms to be made of Biden's campaigning and what that could mean for the general, but I really don't think that there's significant reason to be concerned about the primary at this point. There's always.
All right. What do you make of her framing of RFK as a hangnail more than a headache?
It seems more just like his candidacy is annoying to this set of people, the kind of elite pundit class on the Democratic side. So they want to minimize it, downplay it. I think they're annoyed, actually, with how much I can sense the annoyance kicking in at how much mainstream coverage he's generating, even coverage that is negative and that labels him a kook and an anti-vaxxer, and it is designed to sabotage him, because you have to remember the number one operating principle now, has not always been the case, but now, of sort of mainstream establishment media figures is to prevent conversations from happening. Because so even criticizing him relentlessly from their standpoint, they're starting to look askance at people even in their own tribe who are doing that, because they think that's the wrong tactic. They think the right tactic is silence, is to acknowledge that he exists. Pretend he doesn't exist. Who won New Hampshire? Not Biden? Then whatever. The state doesn't exist. There's 49 of them now.
Yeah, I heard the gentleman over at Pods of America expressing some moderated concern about the primary schedule in an episode from last week. So remember, Joe Biden saying that South Carolina is going to be the first primary doesn't magically make it the case. The states have the ability to set the timing of their own primary. What the Democratic Party says is a suggestion. And so what it's looking increasingly like is that Iowa and New Hampshire, big mad that their kind of primacy, their moment in the spotlight is being taken away, are going to go ahead with the original primary dates. Joe Biden, because he's declared that he's not going to participate there, is not going to participate there, but doesn't mean the primaries aren't happening, which means you'll get days of a media cycle in which either Marianne Williamson or RFK Jr. are going to be counted as the winner of the first two contests that actually vote in the race. And right now, it's worth noting, recent polls show that Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. are neck and neck in New Hampshire. RFK at 9%, Marianne at 8%. Both have been very focused on a strategy of developing their reputations in those states. And New Hampshire in particular is a very freedom-loving, live free or die sort of a place that, one, has really internalized and taken personally what Joe Biden has done trying to rig the primary schedule, and also has a healthy appetite for insurgent, independent-thinking candidates like RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson. It is a state where Joe Biden failed terribly in the 2020 elections. Remember, he did not win a single state until South Carolina, and I think he came in third or fourth, maybe even fifth in New Hampshire. So it's no wonder that he doesn't want to compete there, but that is not the same thing as saying there's not a competitive race afoot.
You mentioned the Pod Save America bros. I wanted to highlight a tweet from Tommy Vitor. He's one of them, right? Who was responding to a New York Times story. Yeah, oh, there, it's up on the screen. That New York Times story that quotes Jason Calacanis, a co-host of a popular podcast on which Mr. Kennedy appeared, saying that that Trump won in 2016 because of social media. The next president will win because of podcasts. Kind of celebrating the importance of podcasts. Tommy Vitor, who ironically has a podcast, responds, "Odd to include this baseless prediction from someone with no campaign experience, but a lot of self-interest in a story about RFK Jr." And then I saw a quote tweet about more people saying that this is from a semaphore guy saying that. Among people who listen to podcasts, the most popular show is Rogan, which 5% of listeners list as their top podcast. If it's the podcast election, you need to get on a lot of podcasts to achieve Trump's 2016 reach. I think that's missing the point a little bit because Rogan only has 5% of the podcast audience, but that's a huge number of people.
Yeah.
Huge number of people. And also, it's not so much that that Trump was like, it's that Trump's social media presence created news that mainstream people did eventually think they had to cover. That's part of the reason why I brought my earlier point stands, because they're going to try to, having learned from that, say, well, don't cover it. Don't cover it critically. Don't cover it at all. So they're going to try to ignore it. And then but this shows the trouble, because in the media, despite there being so much ideological agreement in the mainstream establishment media, there is still competition for likes, viewers, for readers. And it's because there's so many media properties, even though there's broad ideological agreement, it can be hard to get them to all agree to not cover something. It's not like they have regular meetings. They all sit down in the room and they say, how can we suppress narratives we don't like today? Their attempt is to suppress narratives, but it's hard because you can even have dissent among theirs. You have some dissenters at these properties. So the New York Times might say, we really want to cover this, even though we're going to slam him. And some columnists for the New York Times might say, I would like to cover him more favorably. So it breaks down a little bit. And it
moreover,
emerges.
The comparison is not what percent of a podcast audience you're getting. The comparison is compared to regular mainstream media, how much of an audience are you getting? Joe Rogan's shows average 11 million listeners per episode. And I would suspect that an RFK Jr. episode is even on the higher end of their average. Compare that to the average CNN prime time. It's like half a million viewers. Even someone like Tucker Carlson, who was
10 times more.
The top of the game in cable news, was only getting about 3 million on a good day on one of his episodes. So yes, RFK Jr. is completely right about that. And because these are independent podcasts, there's nothing the mainstream media can do about his exposure. It's also worth noting that they keep pressing this. It's name recognition point. At a certain point, I think that is, it doesn't account for his stability in the polls despite all of the negative press against him. And it's worth noting that at 20% approximately, and where he's been since before he announced, that is better than every single person in the increasingly crowded Republican primary fields whose name is not Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump.
Right. I mean, to be clear, I think a name recognition is doing him a lot of good. I think name recognition is more important as a general factor. Just how familiar the person and their last name is to the electorate, I think pundits undervalue that because they think the voters are poring over candidates' views as closely as we, the pundit class, is, when a lot of people don't have time for that because they have real jobs and they're not professional pundit people, and they respond to who they remember for various reasons.
I think his name, who he is, benefited him in his career and gave him a platform to have the presence that he has. But I think that many of the people who like him because he became a real vocal advocate against vaccine mandates, et cetera, under COVID. And that is why he's got that core group of people who really respect him on that particular issue. And that's not a value judgment. That's just a kind of a neutral putting out there. Maybe he would not have been in the position to be, nominated to be on Trump's vaccine safety board if he weren't a Kennedy, all of those kinds of things. But I do think it's confusing the issue a bit. He has a public persona that he has earned through the decisions that he's made and the positions that he's taken that are why he's being credited right now. And I don't think that if Joe Kennedy III, who did run for Congress and was thrashed by Ed Markey in California, in Massachusetts, if that's any example, the Kennedy name, it might get you in the door. It might even get you a resume that you can use to launch your candidacy, but it is not as conclusive a thing as what the mainstream media is trying to present right now.
We'll have more Rising right after this.